Is the housekeeper, Shelly Smith's testimony going to get a conviction for Alex Murdaugh? What do you think, Pat?
I don't know. Her testimony was very important for, I think, both the state and the defense. But for the state, if you look at the fact that she saw Alec Murdaugh come to the house around the time of the murders, potentially supporting his alibi that he went to his mother's house to check in on her. She said that Alec Murdaugh said that he was there for 30 or 40 minutes, and she got emotional and said this really bothered her, and she called her relative in a town in South Carolina to tell him about this. And when asked why did that bother her, she said that he was there for no more than 20 minutes. So there's some clear deception on the part of Alec Murdaugh. So I think that really helped the state in their case of, one, they're just going to spend all day for the next couple of days, obviously, talking about how deceptive he has been with his clients and his law firm and colleagues and everybody else.
I think that this is all connected to what the state is trying to do with all of the law firm witnesses that the jury's going to hear about for the next 2 days, probably, because that's how long it took for these witnesses to testify before the judge. This is all about undercutting his alibi. They, one, have a witness who said that he wasn't there as long as he says he was. We have the Snapchat videos which show definitively that he was in the main house when he said he was. He definitely was near the family, much closer to the time of the murders. And then we have the testimony from the law firm about all of the financial crimes that they had just uncovered and confronted him about that day. That also undercuts his alibi for the jury, because they're wanting to show the jury, you cannot believe a word this man says. His alibi is based on where he says he was at different times. And they're saying, look, this is the same person that was looking people in the face over and over again and stealing totals of millions of dollars from his own clients and from his own law firm where he was going to work every day. This alibi means nothing, is what the state is trying to show.
Yeah, and there was another piece of testimony that was very interesting. A few days after the murders, he showed up at his mother's house very early in the morning and just knocked on the door and said, I'm here, which was odd, but it was also an odd time. This was right around the time that his dad died. The state's saying that, did he usually do this? Well, the circumstances around him going back and forth to this house, in my opinion, that doesn't really convince me of anything that it was odd that he would be going there at a certain time. But he did show up at 6 in the morning, and he evidently had a blue vinyl object that was large. And Miss Shelly Smith, the caretaker, testified that she thought it was a tarp that you would put over a car. When SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division investigators, finally went to his mother's house several months later, they searched.
Well, let's keep in mind, this is important. This is 2.5 months. This is from June 7th until September before they actually go to the house and look through the mother's house.
Yeah. And so when they go upstairs. So Shelley Smith testified that he took this blue tarp, is what we'll call it, because that's what she called it, and it was wadded up in a ball. He took it upstairs, and she didn't really go upstairs and go into bedrooms and closets. She testified she doesn't recognize the closet or the items therein. So she doesn't know where he took this tarp. She just knows that he did it. He came in with this tarp and went upstairs to the second story. And then when they searched the house, they found in a storage container in one of the bedroom closets a folded tarp. Okay, so remember, she said it was balled up, just kind of balled into a ball. They found a folded tarp in a storage container that had dishes and various items underneath it. So it's right on top inside of a storage container. And then they also, in a separate closet upstairs, they found a blue raincoat. this blue raincoat was the center of a motion by the defense to have Miss Smith's testimony excluded. But the important thing about Miss Smith's testimony around the raincoat is she never seen the raincoat. She never seen Alec Murdaugh in the raincoat. So there was nothing about the testimony linking this raincoat to Alec Murdaugh yesterday.
So help me unpack this a little bit. I don't know what the tarp has to do with anything. What's the significance of the tarp?
The significance of the tarp is Miss Shelley Smith saw Alec Murdaugh come to the house carrying what she believed to be a tarp.
What does that have to do with anything?
Well, I think now the state is saying that the tarp, it was not a tarp, it was a raincoat that he carried in.
And that was why the defense was trying to say that this should be excluded as her making that connection, because she never made that connection. The state's just saying she made that connection.
Yeah, I mean, you have both pieces of evidence, right? You have a tarp and a raincoat. Alec Murdaugh has been connected to a tarp, right?
Okay.
But he hasn't been connected to the raincoat.
Let me get this straight. Shelley Smith, the housekeeper, says a couple of days after the murders, Murdaugh shows up at 6 a.m. and he's carrying a tarp. 2.5 months later, Sled goes to the same house, which was his mother's house, where Shelley worked, took care of his mother. And during a search of that house, they uncover a blue tarp.
Yes.
With no significance. There's no blood on it. There's no DNA on it.
I'm aware of. I don't
Nothing's on the tarp. It's just a tarp in a box.
That's my understanding.
But they did find a raincoat, which was also blue.
Yes.
And it had gunshot residue. And they had it in court, and it did test positive for gunshot residue.
Yes.
But it's not a tarp.
It's not a tarp.
This seems extremely confusing for the jury. Okay, so I think this is a big leap the state is trying to make here, which was the basis for the defense's motion to try to exclude this or strike that portion of her testimony, saying we want at least an instruction. The jury's already heard this, right? So we want an instruction to the jury that that testimony about the tarp is irrelevant, that she never said she saw a raincoat. So her testimony has nothing to do with the raincoat that was eventually recovered, because they're trying to get the jury to presume that what she really saw was the raincoat, and the raincoat had gunshot residue. Now, let's talk about the raincoat. Raincoat had gunshot residue. They tested it for other things. What did they find?
They had a SLED investigator on the stand yesterday that testified that she ran several tests that are presumptive, meaning that it's likely that this stain would be blood, right? So they tested that and ran several different types of tests, and each test returned a negative finding, meaning that they did not find a presumption of blood on
Okay, so there's no blood on the raincoat.
There were stains on the raincoat, right, that were reddish and
but they were not blood stains. Could have been anything.
They didn't test.
It's not blood.
Right.
It's not human material.
Right.
Okay.
Well, they didn't test positive. I think that's as far as I would take it.
So they tested negative. If you don't test positive, you test negative, right? Yeah. So they tested negative for blood. It tested negative for human material. It's also uncovered 2.5 months later. So any gunshot residue could have happened in the intervening 2.5 months or prior to the day of the murders, right?
And we don't know whose jacket this is.
That's correct. I mean, it could have been Paul's, could have been the other son's. It could have been anybody who came on the property to shoot guns. We know this family basically had this property out there for no other reason than to sit around and shoot guns. That's what it sounds like.
They hunted a lot. They were testimony. They were shooting hogs and stuff, you know.
Right. They were hunting hogs. So this was like a common thing. There were lots of hogs. They were always like shooting hogs. So anyway, there's lots of shooting going on with lots of guns all the time. So if anybody was wearing that jacket at any time shooting a gun, it would have gunshot residue on it. And we heard about this in opening argument, and the defense quickly stated, like, that there's this raincoat, there's this tarp. You're going to find out that there's no blood on these items. I think there's going to be testimony about a seatbelt at some point, which they say had gunshot residue on Murdaugh's seatbelt. And they point out, but there was no blood And I think this is still the big problem for the state in linking him to the killer, is that we just don't have any evidence that he pulled that trigger, because if he had pulled the trigger, he would have been covered in blood. But what the state has to prove is that he pulled the trigger and he killed these folks. It's still a big problem. And the other thing for the defense, Shelley's testimony is actually helpful for them as well, because it supports his alibi in that he did go to his mom's house. Okay. Yes. He didn't just make up going to his mom's house. We have a witness that shows he was there. When you think back to it, if you weren't timing yourself or had any reason to be keeping time, estimating 20 minutes and estimating 30 to 40 minutes is no real big difference. But I think the most damning thing about it was his telling her that he was there for 40 minutes. That's the biggest thing the state gets out of Shelley. And I'm sure the state's going to make a meal out of that in closing. And we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens next. This is a fascinating story. Every day something new comes up. And we'll be here to comment on all of it and get our reactions. Be sure to subscribe so that you're alerted every time we upload a video, because we'll be doing them daily from here on out until we get a verdict.